The idea of a national health service is a contract between the government and the people of this country. And we don't have a contract with the NHS, we have a contract with the government. So it's the government's responsibility to ensure that we are treated when we are ill. That's what we pay our taxes for. That's what Aneurin Bevan promised from cradle to grave when he established the NHS in 1948, in July, I think. And I mean, it had been mooted for a while by people like Benjamin Moore, even Lloyd George, Addison. You know, this was not something out of the blue. So what the government at the moment is doing is a deflection trick, le genre de main. It's a magician's trick and it's not working. It's trying to suggest that two things. Number one, it's not its fault. And number two, it's going to stand up to the unions who are being unreasonable. Well, the second part first. The second part is simply to champion a sort of the spirit of Thatcher, to channel the spirit of Thatcher. And Rishi Sunak is a fool to think that he can do that. This is a very different situation to the miners' strike. And going back to the spirit of Thatcher, the ghost of Thatcher, it's a misinterpretation of Thatcher. Why? Well, Mrs. May, Liz Truss, both staggered around under the weight of trying to emulate Margaret Thatcher. They both failed because they both failed to read her biographies and her autobiography and the various accounts of her life. They bought into the propaganda put out by particularly the BBC and television broadcasting. That was that she was an iron lady who was inflexible. Actually, if you check the manifestos against what actually happened throughout her period of office, you will see a huge discrepancy. In other words, what she proposed was not what happened. She listened, she took note, she took advice. She took advice on everything, including on her appearance and her voice. She was a very good listener. There are many things she did that maybe we would disapprove of intensely. I certainly would find great fault with Clause 28. I would find fault actually with her stand against the miners. She caused a lot of division. But unlike May and Liz Truss and those people who want to emulate her, she listened. She listened, and I think ultimately she did care, whatever the propaganda suggests. She cared. I don't think Mrs. May or Liz Truss even thought of that. They were too focused on trying to rebuild this Iron Lady image, which was not really what Mrs. Thatcher was. That was an image that was projected onto her by the dying Russian Empire, and it was one she embraced. It was a negative trope that she turned into a positive for herself. And when it comes to the NHS, I think Mrs. Thatcher would have reached a deal long before now. I think Mrs. Thatcher would have recognised that the immigration crisis was something that should have been dealt with on a much broader canvas. I think Mrs. Thatcher would have been the first to have set up visa application centres in France to stop people coming across the channel, to discourage them. And yes, I think she could have been very hawkish about Europe, and she could have been very hawkish about people who were not doing their job. But she would have made absolutely certain that anybody who was potentially having a stroke or a heart attack would be secure and safe, because that is the contract between the government and the people as laid out in the foundation of the NHS. It's not a contract between the people and the NHS. The NHS does not really exist as a concept. The NHS is something the government set up to provide support from cradle to grave. It is a government initiative. The NHS is simply the instrument through which that initiative is carried out. It is the government's responsibility, not the responsibility of the ambulance staff, not the responsibility of the doctors or the nurses. They are simply employed. The government, the buck stops with the government. And this is why Matt Hancock is such an unbelievable disgrace. Because he allowed, if he didn't in fact initiate or encourage, he allowed the mis-selling of PPE. He allowed sloganizing and hypocrisy to dominate. And he failed. He failed absolutely. At a time of crisis, we turn to the government to be there, to lead by example and by initiative. Hancock failed. And at the moment, if Rishi Sunak wishes to take a stance about the NHS, he will also fail. I'm so sorry the nurses are going on strike, and I'm so sorry the ambulance crews are going on strike. I'm also sorry that the government and the minister in charge, Barclay, are determined not to listen. But talks have started. Talks should continue, and these strikes should be called off. The issue about the trains is an entirely different one. That doesn't have the same moral weight. The NHS has a moral weight because it is central, because it is something which was proposed by the government with a moral assurance from cradle to grave. And we are failing people if we don't provide that assurance. It doesn't matter where we get it from. If we have to employ the army, we have to employ the army. But we have to man those ambulances, and we have to do the job. And it's the government's responsibility.